I've entitled my thoughts for today, Undeserving. And we'll be looking at a parable Jesus told as recorded in Luke's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. On Interstate 94, about an hour west of Minneapolis, there are signs marking exits to the Lake Woebegone Trail. Lake Woebegone does not actually exist, except as a fictional place in the whimsical stories told by American humorist Garrison Keillor. Garrison Keillor would begin his weekly stories with the words, "It's been a quiet week in Lake Woebegone." But his stories are perhaps most famous for the line, "Welcome to Lake Woebegone, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average." We laugh inwardly at the joke, but who among us doesn't see ourselves as being above average? Garrison Keillor's stories detailing the competitive spirit between the German Catholics and the Norwegian and Swedish Lutherans in a fictitious Minnesota town are entertaining enough, but I doubt that even Garrison Keillor anticipated that his stories would coin a sociological term. The Lake Woebegone effect has come to refer to the very human tendency to overestimate one's positive characteristics and to underestimate one's negative characteristic. Sociologists call that tendency a superiority bias, and having a superiority bias is not a favorable term. None of us wants to be congratulated on having a superiority bias. None of us wants to admit to seeing ourselves as better than others. But it's one of those things that's so much easier to recognize in other people. Not surprisingly, Jesus told a parable which illustrates the danger of a superiority bias. The two characters in the parable are a Pharisee and a tax collector. We easily assume that the Bible talks about the Pharisees so often because they were the bad guys. But in their society, they were actually the good guys. Tax collectors, on the other hand, have never lost their status as bad guys. And so maybe this story makes more sense for us if we think of it as the parable of the faithful churchgoer and the tax collector. This is what happened according to Luke 18, verses 9 to 14. To some who were confident of their own righteousness, and you can think superiority bias, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, you can think faithful churchgoer, and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, the faithful churchgoer, stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus' parable invites us to ask a couple of questions. First, what makes a person righteous, or we could say a good Christian? And two, what is a sinner? The Pharisee in the story had a simple answer to these questions. For the Pharisee, a righteous person was someone who not only kept the requirements of religion, but went beyond those requirements. According to Leviticus 16:29, everyone was required to fast once a year on the Day of Atonement. The Pharisees as a whole improved on that command by fasting not once a year, but once a week. And this particular Pharisee doubled even that challenging practice and fasted twice a week. No wonder he had a superiority bias. Then, according to Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 to 23, people were supposed to tithe or give a tenth of what their fields produced. But this man went beyond what was expected and tithed on everything he had. Because he went beyond the demands of religious law, the Pharisee felt justifiably confident that he was truly a righteous man. Proud of that righteousness, the Pharisee went as far as thanking God that he wasn't a sinner like other people. He didn't rob, didn't commit adultery, and he certainly wasn't like the nearby tax collector who took advantage of people. But as good as the Pharisee, or we could say the faithful churchgoer, as good as he saw himself as being, he had completely failed to understand the essence of righteousness and sin. Righteousness, of course, is good, and sin is bad, but Jesus' parable makes it clear that the Pharisee did not correctly distinguish between good and bad. It's easy to see that this Pharisee practiced a random view of righteousness and sin. Random because he embraced and rejected certain behaviors without really understanding why they were helpful and important. That's not surprising because our human tendency is to have a random view of righteousness and sin. We don't always know why certain behaviors make us good Christians on the one hand or sinners on the other, but we're fairly certain that they do. For instance, why did fasting twice a week justify the Pharisee into thinking he was more righteous than the next person? You can be sure that he made other people feel guilty because of his extra fasting, because that's what people who have a random view of righteousness do. The Pharisees' kind of righteousness can be measured with statistics. For instance, in the number of minutes spent in prayer, by the number of chapters of the Bible read, by the number of times that a person attends church. We can be sure that it's not by accident that the Pharisee made reference to numbers, to how often he fasted, and to how much he tithed. Like the Pharisee, people who hold a random view of righteousness choose behaviors that are convenient for them. Over the years, for instance, I have run into people who gauge their righteousness according to the theological views that fit their personal preference, or according to the number of times they share their faith, even though they might not be nice people to be around. It's that random approach to righteousness which gives people outside the church the opportunity to mock Christians. People outside the church don't care, for instance, how often Christians go to church, but they sure do care about character issues like integrity. I once heard a speaker put it this way: do people outside the church see the church as correcting or as connecting? Just like the Pharisee took a random view of righteousness, it's also tempting to take a random view of sin. We're not really sure why something is a sin, but we're pretty sure it is. Many years ago, an American missionary couple with whom we became friends talked about discovering regional sins as they traveled about the U.S. giving reports on their work. What was a sin in one place wasn't sin in another. No wonder non-religious people end up assuming that religions are made up of rules that don't make sense. We can look at people who practice other religions and wonder why they are required to keep rules we don't understand, all the while failing to realize that they might look at us in the same way. According to Jesus' parable, the biggest problem with misidentifying righteousness and sin is when we use our personal definitions of righteousness and sin to enable us to see ourselves as being superior to other people. There's something seriously wrong with our definitions of righteousness and sin if they promote a superiority bias. This parable has been instrumental in helping me form my own understanding of sin. For me, a helpful way of understanding sin is that sin is whatever gets in the way of a relationship with God, with people, and with myself. While certain behaviors are symptomatic of sin, the proof is in the damage caused to relationships. There is no such thing as a random sin in the Bible. If the Bible tells us not to do something, it's because it gets in the way of a relationship with God or with others or with ourselves. For instance, if we look at the 10 Commandments, the first 4 have to do with our relationship to God. Don't have other gods, don't make idols, don't misuse God's name, keep the Sabbath holy. And the last 6 have to do with our relationships with people. Honor your parents, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't slander, don't lust after your neighbor's stuff. Jesus' parable makes it clear that it's not only our relationships with God and other people which matter. From the outside, the Pharisee projected an image of sin-free righteousness, when in fact he had failed miserably. His superiority bias had damaged the relationship he had with himself, making him unable to recognize his own need. It's tempting to think that as long as our actions don't cause damage to our relationships with other people, we're okay. And we fail to acknowledge the damage we have caused to the way we relate to ourselves. Private sins, which no one else sees, are devastating because they damage the way we relate to ourselves. Whether those sins cause us to incorrectly see ourselves as inferior or as superior, they have damaged the relationship we have with ourselves. The Pharisee's fatal problem was that he failed to see himself as undeserving. Because he considered himself to be righteous and not a sinner like the tax collector, he concluded that he deserved God's favor. It's not so hard to be convinced that we need God. Feeling we need God can occur anytime something goes wrong in our lives. What is much harder to admit is that we are undeserving. In contrast to the Pharisee, the tax collector proved that the pathway to righteousness begins with seeing ourselves as undeserving. It's no wonder that we have trouble seeing ourselves as undeserving because we are inundated with advertising which seeks to convince us that we are deserving instead of undeserving. It's hard to admit that we aren't above average, that we aren't just a wee bit better than the tax collector or whatever image we want to attach. It's hard to admit that personal achievement doesn't make us superior people. And it's sobering to realize that whenever we see ourselves as being superior to other people, our relationship with God, with people, and even with ourselves is doomed. The best love affairs begin with seeing ourselves as undeserving of another person's attention. The times I am most in love with my wife, Faith, is when I know that I am undeserving of her. And those are the times I sense she is the most responsive to me. We have to be careful, though. Seeing ourselves as undeserving has to be genuine. If we secretly harbor a superiority bias, we will be in trouble. As with the Pharisee, how we view other people is going to be a good indicator of how we come before God. It's when we comprehend how undeserving we are that we begin to enjoy the fruits of our connection with God, with other people, and even with ourselves.